welcome to the dimmed light. It is a deep pleasure to have your company here tonight. Before we begin our slow journey into the distant past, take a moment just to notice where you are right now. Look around your space in the soft light. What time is it in your quiet corner of the world? Perhaps the city lights are fading far outside your window, replaced by the deep indigo of late night. Or maybe the profound, heavy silence of the countryside already surrounds you. I would love to know where you are joining us from and the hour you have chosen for stillness. In the comments below, if you feel inclined to share. If this space brings you a sense of peace, please consider subscribing to our channel and gently turning on notifications so you never miss a quiet voyage into history's sleeping hours. Now, let the weight of the day simply dissolve like sugar in warm water. There is nothing else you need to do right now. There is nowhere else you need to be. Allow your body to sink a little deeper into your mattress or your chair, feeling fully supported. Unclench your jaw slowly. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, releasing the tension you have held since morning. Breathe in slowly, feeling the cool, calming air fill your lungs, and breathe out, releasing any lingering tightness. Tonight, we are traveling back nearly 2,000 years to the very edge of a vast empire. Can you imagine a formidable wall of stone stretching across a wild northern landscape hidden in fog? Can you feel the damp, bracing chill of an ancient mist against your cheek? What does it feel like to stand guard at the boundary of the known world, wrapped in the secure solitude of the Roman night? Let us find that quiet place together. The air inside the barrack block of Mila Castle 37 was thick, comforting, and undeniably warm. It was a dense warmth, built up over hours, smelling of dried mud walls, old oiled leather, and the pervasive, sweet scent of burning peat mixed with slow, consuming oak logs in the central hearth. Cassius sat on the edge of his low wooden bunk, a space that had been his sanctuary for the past 6 months. The rough, textured wool of his undyed tunic scratched gently against his skin, a familiar, grounding sensation that anchored him in the present moment. Around him, the rhythmic, deep breathing of his 8 sleeping comrades created a soft, continuous chorus. It was a human lullaby, a sound that spoke of safety, shared fatigue, and the communal rest of soldiers. He rubbed his eyes slowly with the heels of his hands, feeling the lingering grit of sleep in the corners. The embers in the large stone hearth cast a low, fluctuating orange glow across the long room. The light painted long, flickering shadows that danced lazily against the rough, hewn timber walls and the stacked weaponry. It was time. He reached down for his sandals. The caliga, which rested on the packed earth floor, Their thick leather soles were studded with heavy iron hobnails that clinked softly against a stray pebble. He laced them up slowly, meticulously. His fingers moved with the practiced, almost thoughtless ease of 20 years of service in the legions. The leather straps were stiff with the persistent cold of the north, but they warmed quickly against the skin of his ankles and calves. He pulled the laces tight, ensuring a snug fit that would support him through the long night hours. Next came the subermallis, the thick, padded linen garment worn beneath the armor to prevent chafing. It was soft from years of wear, worn thin in places, smelling faintly of his own dried sweat and the dried lavender bunches hanging from the rafters to keep moths away. Then the weight. He stood up and lifted the lorica segmentata, the segmented metal plate armor that sat on a wooden stand. The iron was cold to the touch, humming with a deep chill, even though it had been kept inside the heated room. He slid it carefully over his head, maneuvering his arms through the openings. The metal plates clattered softly against each other, a sound dampened significantly by the thick linen underneath, but still distinct in the quiet room. He began to tighten the leather straps at the front and back, feeling the familiar, secure constriction around his chest and ribs. It was a comforting weight, one he had grown to rely on. It was a shell. It was a sturdy barrier between his fragile body and the unpredictable world outside these walls. He picked up his belt, the cingulum, heavy with its hanging leather strips, adorned with bronze studs that jingled like quiet bells. It buckled around his waist with a solid, satisfying click. Finally, he reached for his helmet, the Gallia, which rested on a high shelf. He held it in his large hands for a moment, tracing the smooth curve of the hinged cheek guards with his thumb. The metal was polished, but showed signs of use, smooth and cool beneath his touch. He placed it slowly on his head, fastening the chin strap. The world instantly became muffled, distant. The sound of the sleeping men receded into a background hum. His own breathing became louder, echoing slightly within the protective, iron dome of the helmet. He felt contained. He felt prepared. He picked up his heavy woolen cloak, the sagum, dyed a deep brownish red that looked almost black in the dim firelight. It was thick, heavy, and slightly oily to the touch. The natural lanolin left in the wool promising defense against the inevitable northern rain. He draped it over his shoulders, the weight settling reassuringly. He pulled it tight around his neck, fastening it with a heavy, ornate bronze brooch, shaped like a sleeping lion. He grabbed his spear, the hesta, its ash wood shaft polished smooth by years of handling. He did not take his large rectangular shield. Tonight, it was a quiet, static watch, not a patrol. He took a deep breath of the warm, smoky air, savoring it one last time. He moved slowly toward the heavy oak door of the barracks. The thick iron hinges groaned softly, a deep bass sound, as he pushed it open just enough to slip through. Immediately, shockingly, the heat of the room was snatched away. The night air rushed in to meet him, sharp, biting, and incredibly clean. It smelled intensely of wet stone, soaked earth, damp moss, and the distant, salty tang of the sea, carried on the prevailing east wind. The transition was brutal, but invigorating, waking his senses fully. He stepped over the high wooden threshold, and the heavy door thumped shut behind him with a sound of finality, sealing the warmth and light inside. He was out. The darkness was absolute for several long heartbeats until his eyes began to adjust. There was no moon visible. The starlight was filtered through thick, low, hanging clouds that scraped the tops of the nearby hills. The rain had stopped for the moment, but the air hung heavy with extraordinary moisture. A thick, clinging mist wrapped around everything, softening the edges of the stone buildings within the fort. He stood still for a moment, letting his body adjust to the drop in temperature. He could feel the cold seeking out the exposed skin on his face and hands. He pulled his cloak tighter, burying his chin in the scratchy wool. He took his first step onto the paved pathway leading to the wall stairs. His hobnailed sandals crunched satisfyingly on the wet gravel. He began the slow, familiar walk towards the stone steps that would take him up to the walkway of Hadrian's wall. The fort around him was silent, save for the occasional snort of a horse in the stables and the dripping of water from the slate roofs. He was alone with the night, the stone, and the mist. The weight of his armor felt manageable now, a part of him. He reached the base of the stone stairs, the steps slick with moisture. He gripped the cold, wet stone handrail and began to ascend, his breath already forming small, ghostly clouds of steam in the frigid air. Up he went, leaving the relative safety of the ground level, rising towards the narrow ribbon of stone that separated the empire from the vast, unknowable expanse of the north. Cassius placed his right foot on the first heavy stone step, feeling the solid resistance beneath the thick leather sole of his sandal. The step was tall, cut for the long legs of marching men, and he felt the familiar strain in his thigh muscle as he lifted his weight. He exhaled a long, slow breath that turned instantly into a white plume of vapor, drifting up and disappearing into the darkness above. He gripped the rough, cold stone of the low wall that flanked the stairs. The stone was wet, slick with a layer of condensation that had formed as the temperature dropped. Under his fingertips, he could feel the minute textures of the masonry. He felt the small, sharp ridges, where the chisel had struck years ago. He felt the softness of a patch of damp moss that had taken root in a crevice, cold and spongy like a living velvet. He took another step, the iron hobnails on his boots crunching with a gritty, solid sound against the wet grit. Step by step, he ascended, rising above the muddy ground of the fort, rising above the sleeping world of men. With each upward movement, the sounds of the barracks, the faint snoring, the shifting timber, faded further away, replaced by the growing sound of the wind. It was not a howling wind tonight, but a steady, pressing breeze that whispered as it flowed over the stonework. He reached the halfway landing and paused for a moment to catch his breath. He turned his head slightly, the cheek guards of his helmet grazing against his jaw. Below him, the fort was a grid of shadows. He could see the faint, glowing outline of the bathhouse chimney, puffing lazy smoke into the damp air. It looked small from here, a tiny island of warmth in a vast ocean of cold night. He turned back to the stairs and continued his climb. His armor shifted with his movements, the leather straps creaking softly, a rhythmic accompaniment to his ascent. The weight of the chainmail and plate seemed to increase slightly as he tired, but it was a good weight, a grounding weight. He finally reached the top step and stepped out onto the sentry walk. The world suddenly opened up. Here, 15 feet above the ground, the air felt different. It was thinner, sharper, and moved with more freedom. He stood on the paved walkway that stretched out to his left and right, disappearing almost immediately into the thick wall of fog. It was like standing on a stone ribbon suspended in the sky. To his north, over the crenellated battlements, there was only a profound, abyssal darkness. The land beyond the wall fell away into a black void, swallowing the hills, the trees, and the streams that he knew were there. There were no fires burning in the north tonight, no distant torches, just the heavy, silent blanket of the wild. To his south, the military road was a faint, pale line tracing the contour of the valley, empty and silent. Cassius adjusted his heavy wool cloak, pulling it tighter around his shoulders to seal out the drafting wind. The wool was damp on the surface, but remained warm and dry against his tunic. He shifted his grip on his spear, the wood cold and smooth, and began his patrol. He did not march. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, a stroll that had no destination other than the passage of time. He placed his feet carefully, avoiding the deeper puddles that had gathered in the depressions of the stone flags. He watched the water ripple in these small pools, disturbed by the vibration of his own footsteps. The mist swirled around him, moving like a slow, silent river. It dampened the sound of his boots. It softened the hard edges of the stone merlons. Sometimes the fog would thin for a heartbeat, revealing the silhouette of a distant turret, only to close in again, wrapping him once more in solitary confinement. He felt an immense sense of solitude, but not of loneliness. It was a solitude that felt private, exclusive. He was the only eyes of the Empire in this sector, the sole witness to the shifting moods of the night. He walked past a wooden door leading down to a Mila castle, but he did not stop. He continued along the curtain wall, his eyes scanning the darkness out of habit rather than expectation. The stone beneath him felt unshakable. It was a testament to order, to geometry, to the sheer will of construction that had placed these millions of blocks here, one by one, in the middle of the wilderness. He ran his gloved hand along the top of the parapet as he walked. The stone was cold, freezing cold, sucking the heat from the leather of his glove. He felt the rhythm of the crenellations. Stone, gap, open space, solid wall. It was a hypnotic pattern. The rhythm of the architecture matched the rhythm of his breath. In and out, step and step, stone and gap. He stopped for a moment and leaned against the merlon, looking out into the nothingness of the north. He closed his eyes for a second, listening. He could hear the faint trickle of water running down the face of the wall. He could hear the rustle of dry heather in the ditch far below. He could hear the blood rushing in his own ears, a low, thrumming sound. He opened his eyes and saw a single drop of water fall from the rim of his helmet, catching a stray glimmer of light before vanishing into the dark. He was a statue of flesh and iron, standing on a monument of stone, suspended in a world of water and air. He took a deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of the mist, and pushed himself off the wall to continue his slow, measured walk into the fog. The night was young, and the wall was long. There was no hurry. There was only the walk, the stone, and the waiting. Cassius continued his slow advance into the shifting gray. The mist had thickened, becoming almost palpable, a soft, damp curtain that brushed against his face. It was not merely air anymore. It felt like a physical substance, a boundless ocean of vapor that had risen to swallow the world. He moved through it, as if wading through shallow, still water. The moisture clung to everything. It settled on the rough fibers of his woolen cloak, forming thousands of tiny, glistening beads. They caught the faint, diffused starlight, sparkling momentarily like diamond dust before soaking into the heavy fabric, making the cloak feel incrementally heavier on his shoulders. The dampness found the exposed skin of his face, cooling his cheeks, settling in the coarse hair of his beard, and gathering on his eyelashes. He blinked slowly, clearing his vision, though there was little to see but the swirling fog. He paused again in his slow patrol, brought to a halt not by any sound or sight, but by the overwhelming stillness. He leaned his shoulder gently against the solid stonework of a crenellation. The cold of the stone seeped through his wool tunic, a sharp contrast to the lingering warmth of his body. He remained motionless, becoming part of the architecture. He looked down at the stone block right in front of his face. In the daylight, it would be a uniform, imposing gray. But in this dim, wet light, it revealed a hidden landscape. He saw deep greens that bordered on black. He saw streaks of rust where iron deposits in the rock had oxidized over decades of rain. He saw the intricate, lace-like patterns of white lichen spreading slowly across the surface, a silent, slow, motion explosion of life on the dead mineral. He leaned closer, his breath warming the stone for a fleeting second. He focused his eyes on a deep crack between two massive ashlar blocks. There, sheltered from the harshest winds, a thick patch of moss had taken hold. It was a miniature forest, a tiny, thriving ecosystem in the heart of the military fortification. The moss was plump and swollen with water, like a living green sponge. He watched a single, large drop of water that hung precariously from the tip of a moss frond. It trembled slightly in the almost imperceptible breeze, growing heavier, stretching the fibers of the plant. It held on for a long moment, defying gravity, before finally, silently, releasing. It fell and struck the stone ledge below with a tiny, almost inaudible plip. The sound was so small, yet in this immense quiet, it felt significant. Cassius closed his eyes, letting the visual world dissolve into gray nothingness, allowing his other senses to take over completely. The silence was not empty. It was a tapestry woven from tiny, wet noises. He heard another drip fall from the overhanging roof of a distant turret. He heard the soft sizzle of moisture settling on stone. He heard the wind sighing as it passed through the gaps in the battlements, a low, mournful whistle that sounded like the wall itself was breathing. It was a lonely sound, a hollow sound, but it was also peaceful. He breathed in deeply through his nose, filling his lungs with the frigid, saturated air. The smell was intense and singular. It was the smell of wet stone, dominant and overpowering. It was an ancient smell, the scent of mountains crushed, transported, and reassembled here at the edge of the world. Underneath the stone, he could detect faint traces of other things the earthy, rich smell of wet peat soil rising from the moorlands far below, the faint, metallic tang of his own armor dampening in the night, and the clean, sharp scent of cold water itself. He opened his eyes slowly. The cold was seeping deeper now, finding its way through the layers of wool and linen, touching his skin. It was not a painful cold, not yet. It was a steady, persistent presence, a reminder of where he was. He shifted his weight thoughtfully from one foot to the other. His leather harness creaked softly, a comfortable, familiar sound of worn gear. The metal plates of his lorica segmentata shifted against each other, clinking softly, the sound instantly muffled by the heavy, damp air. He felt the solid, immovable reality of the flagstone beneath his hobnailed boots. The wall was unmoving. It was permanent. It was a vast anchor of order cast onto a chaotic landscape. He felt small against it, transient. The wall had been here before he was born, and it would be here long after he returned to the dust. This thought was not sad to him tonight. It was profoundly comforting. It gave him a sense of place, a fixed point in a spinning world. He was just one watcher in a long line of watchers, all part of the same silent vigil. He pushed himself gently off the wall, feeling the momentary resistance of his wet cloak peeling away from the wet stone. He readjusted his grip on the cold, smooth ash wood shaft of his spear. He took another slow, deliberate step forward into the swirling gray void. The mist parted reluctantly to let him pass, then closed in behind him instantly, erasing his path. He walked on, a silent sentinel in a dissolving world, matching his rhythm to the slow, deep breathing of the night. Cassius walked on. He had lost count of his steps. He had lost track of the time. There was only the rhythm of the walk, a slow pendulum swing of one leg past the other. The fog seemed to have swallowed the entire world, leaving only this narrow stone path suspended in a gray void. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were walking not on the earth, but in some ethereal space between wakefulness and dreams. The cold was now a constant companion, a deep, settled chill that had seeped through the layers of wool and leather, finding the bone. He flexed his fingers inside his thick woolen gloves, feeling the stiffness in his knuckles. He shifted his grip on the spear shaft again, moving his hand to a slightly warmer spot on the wood where his palm had rested previously. He kept his eyes focused forward, staring into the swirling density of the mist. Then, subtly, the texture of the darkness began to change. It was not a sudden appearance, but a slow, gradual coalescence of shadows ahead. A shape was forming in the formless gray. It was darker than the fog, a solid, geometric block of deeper blackness that refused to move with the wind. It was Milecastle 38. As he drew closer, the imposing square outline of the stone tower became clearer, rising starkly from the curtain wall. It was a beacon of order in the chaotic swirl of the vapor. And then he saw the light. It was a tiny, insignificant thing against the vastness of the night, but it drew his eye instantly. It was a faint, diffuse glow spilling from the doorway of the tower's upper chamber, located on the level of the sentry walk. The light was warm, a soft, hazy orange that stained the surrounding mist like ink dropped into water. It caught the moisture in the air, creating a shimmering aura around the entrance. Cassius slowed his pace even further as he approached the source of this warmth. The air changed again. The monotonous smell of wet stone and damp earth was suddenly pierced by a sharp, welcome new scent. It was wood smoke. It was a thin ribbon of smell, acrid yet comforting, speaking of dry timber consuming itself in heat. He breathed it in deeply, letting the aroma awaken a memory of fire. Beneath the smoke, he detected the fainter, heavier smell of burning lamp oil, a scent inseparable from Roman evenings. He reached the doorway. The heavy wooden door was ajar, propped open just enough to let a sliver of light escape. Standing in the gap, framed by the warm glow from within, was another figure. It was Decimus, a soldier from the remote hills of Hispania, a man of few words even in the bright light of day. In the darkness, he was just a silhouette of iron and wool, defined by the rim of light catching the edge of his helmet and the curve of his shoulder armor. Decimus did not move as Cassius approached. He simply stood there, a silent guardian of the small sanctuary of warmth. Cassius stopped a few feet away. He did not speak. To speak would be to break the profound spell of the silence that lay over the land. The only sound was the soft hiss of the wind around the corner of the tower and the rhythmic dripping of condensation from the stone lintel above the door. Decimus turned his head slowly. The movement was stiff with cold. His eyes, deep in the shadow of his helmet's brow guard, met Cassius's. There was no need for greetings. There was a shared understanding in that brief exchange of glances, a silent acknowledgment of the long hours, the biting cold, and the endless damp. It was the camaraderie of shared endurance. Decimus gave a barely perceptible nod, a slight dip of his iron-clad head. Cassius returned the nod, a slow, deliberate movement. He stepped closer to the doorway, just for a moment. He felt the wave of heat radiating from inside strike his cold face. It was glorious and painful all at once. He caught a glimpse of the interior, a flickering terracotta oil lamp on a rough wooden table, casting long, dancing shadows. A small iron brazier with a few glowing red coals glowing stubbornly at its heart, a stool with a worn leather seat. It was a tiny pocket of civilization, a fragile bubble of light against the overwhelming dark. The temptation to step inside, to sit by the brazier, and let the heat soak into his frozen knees, was immense, but it was not his time. His watch was the moving watch, the walking vigil. He lingered for one more heartbeat, absorbing the sight of the firelight, storing the warmth in his memory against the cold ahead. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned away. He turned his back on the orange glow and faced the gray void once more. Behind him, he heard the soft scrape of wood on stone as Decimus gently pushed the heavy door until it was almost closed, sealing the light away again. The darkness felt deeper now, more complete than before. The silence rushed back in to fill the space. Cassius adjusted the weight of his cloak, gripped his spear tightly, and began to walk again, moving away from the tower, back into the solitude of the wall. Cassius moved further away from the warmth of the tower, and as the memory of the fire faded from his skin, the wind began to speak. It had been a whisper before, a shy presence hiding behind the mist. But here, on this exposed stretch of the ridge, it found its voice. It was not an angry wind. It did not howl or shriek. It was a steady, sweeping current of air that poured over the landscape like an invisible river. It came from the north, rolling down from the distant, unseen Cheviot hills, gathering speed across the empty moors, rushing through the valleys of heather and peat until it struck the stone face of the wall. It rose up the vertical cliff of the masonry, curling over the battlements where Cassius walked. He could feel the physical weight of it pressing against him. It pushed gently, but firmly against his left side, a constant, leaning pressure. He adjusted his stance, leaning slightly into the draft, finding a balance between his body and the moving air. He stopped walking for a moment to listen. He closed his eyes and let the visual world fade away entirely, giving himself over to the auditory landscape. The wind was a master musician, playing the world like an instrument. He heard the low, hollow bass note as the air rushed over the deep ditch, the vallum, dug into the earth far below the wall. It was a deep, thrumming vibration that he felt in his chest as much as he heard it. He heard the sharper, sibilant hiss as the breeze cut through the tall, dry grasses that grew in the cracks of the crags. It sounded like 1,000 quiet secrets being whispered all at once. He heard the soft, fluttering snap of his own heavy woolen cloak. The loose corner of the fabric danced in the air, whipping gently against his calf with a rhythmic, soft thud. Thud, 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 thud. It was a hypnotic, repetitive beat. He focused on the sound of the air passing through the crest of his helmet. The metal ridge acted like a flute, catching the wind and turning it into a faint, high-pitched whistle. It was a lonely, thin sound, a single clear note that held steady for a moment, then wavered and dipped as the wind shifted direction, then returned, pure and clear. It was the song of the sentinel. Cassius reached up with a gloved hand and touched the cold metal of his helmet, feeling the slight vibration of the wind humming through the bronze. He felt a strange sense of connection, The wind that touched his face was the same air that had touched the icy oceans far to the north. It was the same air that had swept over the pine forests of Caledonia. It carried with it the scent of places he would never see, places that were wild and free. He opened his eyes and looked out over the parapet. The mist had lifted slightly, pushed back by the breeze, revealing the landscape below in shades of deep charcoal and black. Far down in the valley, he saw the dull, flat gleam of Crag Luff. The lake lay silent and dark, a mirror of black glass. The wind rippled its surface, creating patterns of texture that moved slowly across the water, barely visible in the gloom. He watched the ripples move, tracking their slow progress from one shore to the other. It was a slow motion dance of water and air. The cold was sharper now, driven by the wind. It nipped at his nose and ears. He pulled his head down further into the collar of his tunic, creating a small pocket of warm, still air around his neck. He breathed into this space, warming himself with his own breath. He was a self-contained world, a small island of life in the vast, windy element. He gripped his spear tighter. The ash wood shaft was cold, but it felt solid and reassuring. The wind pushed against the spear too, trying to turn it in his hand, but he held it firm. He enjoyed the resistance. It made him feel grounded. It made him feel present. He took a step forward, breaking his stillness. He began to walk again, pushing his body through the stream of air. He fell into a new rhythm, his steps sensing with the pulses of the wind. Step, push, step, push. He was walking into the wind, walking into the night, walking into the heart of the silence. The wall stretched out ahead of him, a pale gray line curving over the spine of the hills, leading him onward. He was not just guarding a border, he was witnessing the breathing of the world. And in that vast, rhythmic breathing, he found a deep, hypnotic peace. The night deepened. The hours stretched out, losing their definition, melting into a continuous, fluid stream of time. Cassius had entered the state that every soldier knew well, the trance of the middle watch. It was a waking sleep, a peculiar suspension of the mind where the body continued its work while the consciousness drifted in a calm, gray sea. The sharp awareness of the cold had faded, replaced by a dull, numbing acceptance. He was no longer fighting the temperature. He existed within it. He moved with the mechanical precision of a water wheel, driven by the current of his own discipline. He became acutely aware of the weight he carried. Earlier in the night, the armor had felt like a shell. Now it felt like an anchor. The lorica segmentata sat heavy on his shoulders. He could feel the specific pressure points where the iron plates overlapped, pressing down through the padded subarmalis. It was a heavy, constant embrace. It pulled him down towards the earth, grounding him, preventing him from floating away into the mist. He felt the gravity in his knees with every step. He felt the slight, repetitive impact travel up his shins as his heels struck the stone. It was a rhythmic thudding that echoed in his bones. Thud, thud, thud. He focused his attention on his feet. They were the engine of his patrol. He could feel the leather straps of his caliga holding his feet secure. The leather had softened with the dampness, molding perfectly to the shape of his arches and ankles. He felt the subtle shift of the wool socks against his skin. He felt the uneven surface of the flagstones through the thick soles. Some stones were smooth and slippery, worn down by generations of sandals before his. Others were rough and pitted, gripping the iron hobnails. He navigated this terrain without looking, his feet reading the story of the stone like fingers reading Braille. The sound of his movement was the only reality. The chink, chink, chink of the metal apron hanging from his belt created a soft, metallic metronome. It was a lulling sound, repetitive and harmless. The tip of his scabbard tapped gently against his thigh with every left stride. Tap, step, tap, step. It was a lullaby of gear and motion. His mind detached from the landscape. He was no longer looking at the dark hills or the misty void. He was looking inward. Thoughts floated by like the fog, slow, formless, and vanishing before he could grasp them. He thought of the warm bread from the morning meal. He thought of the smell of dry straw in a summer barn. He thought of nothing at all. His breathing slowed to match his pace. In for 3 steps. Out for 3 steps. The air he inhaled was no longer sharp. It tasted flat and metallic, the taste of the deep night. He blinked slowly, his eyelids feeling heavy, as if weighted with small lead coins. The darkness at the edge of his vision seemed to creep closer, narrowing his world to the few feet of wet pavement immediately ahead of him. He was a solitary figure moving through a tunnel of silence. The solitude was absolute, but it was not lonely. It was a heavy, blanketed solitude that wrapped around him, insulating him from the worries of the day. There was no war here. There were no orders to shout. There was only the walk, the eternal, circular walk. He was simply a body moving through space, a pendulum swinging in the dark clock of the empire. He took another step, and another, sinking deeper into the rhythm, sinking deeper into the peace of the heavy, mindless march. The rhythm of the march was broken not by a sound, but by a shift in the air itself. Cassius slowed his pace, his boots scuffing gently to a halt on the wet flagstones. The heavy, damp curtain of mist that had wrapped him in solitude for hours was beginning to tear. The wind, which had been a low, steady pressure against his shoulder, suddenly freshened. It swirled with a new energy, lifting the heavy vapors up and away. like a hand drawing back a veil from a sleeping face. He stood completely still, planting the butt of his spear on the stone, and looked up. Above him, the solid gray ceiling of the world was fracturing. Great, ragged islands of cloud were drifting apart, driven by the currents of the upper atmosphere. And in the widening gaps between them, the true night was revealing itself. It was not black, but a deep, profound indigo, a color of infinite depth and softness. Then the moon broke through. It emerged from behind a bank of dissolving cloud, full and impossibly bright. It was a perfect, silent sphere of white fire, hanging suspended in the cold void. Its light did not fall, it poured. It washed over the wall in a sudden, silent flood of silver. Cassius blinked, his eyes adjusting to this new, spectral illumination. The world, which had been flat and gray moments ago, was suddenly transformed into a landscape of high contrast. The wet stones of the walkway, soaked by the earlier drizzle, caught the moonlight and held it. The path ahead of him was no longer a dull road of rock. It was a river of scattered silver coins. Every puddle, every slick patch of moss, every wet iron nail on the door of the distant Mile Castle glittered with a cold, hard brilliance. The shadows that stretched out from the battlements were long and sharp, deep pools of ink against the glowing stone. He took a deep breath. The air tasted different now. The heavy, earthy humidity of the fog was gone, replaced by a crisp, dry clarity. It was the taste of high altitude, the taste of space. He felt a sudden, strange sense of weightlessness. The heavy armor on his shoulders seemed to lighten, lifted by the sheer vastness of the sky above. He tilted his head back, letting the cheek guards of his helmet fall away from his jaw, exposing his face fully to the moonlight. It felt cool and cleansing on his skin. He scanned the heavens. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, piercing the darkness as the clouds continued to scatter. He saw the slow, steady wheel of the constellations. He saw the faint, milky dust of the galaxy stretching across the zenith. He did not know the names of all the stars. Those were for the philosophers in Alexandria or the priests in Rome. But he knew their positions. He knew they were the same stars that looked down on his home village far to the south. He knew they were the same stars shining on the desert sands of Egypt and the forests of Germania. This thought brought him a profound sense of connection. He was alone on this wall, separated from his kin by miles of darkness and years of duty. Yet he stood under the same roof as every other soul in the empire. He watched a small, ragged wisp of cloud drift across the face of the moon. It glowed with a pearlescent light for a moment, translucent and fragile, before dissolving into nothingness. The silence of the night felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, muffled silence of the fog. It was an expansive, resonant silence. It was the silence of a cathedral, vast and hollow. He felt small, infinitesimal against the scale of the sky, and in that smallness there was a great relief. His worries, his fatigue, the ache in his legs, all of it seemed to shrink, becoming insignificant beneath the slow, majestic rotation of the spheres. He was just a speck of dust, witnessing the glory of the universe. He lowered his gaze back to the horizon. The landscape below the wall was now visible in ghostly outline. The hills rolled away like the backs of sleeping giants, bathed in the blue, gray light. The lake in the valley was a sheet of polished platinum. It was a beautiful, frozen world, suspended in time. Cassius stood there for a long time, simply breathing, simply seeing. He let the silver light soak into him, quieting his mind, washing away the last dregs of the day. He was a sentinel of the moon now, guarding the peace of the silver night. With a slow, deep exhale, he adjusted his grip on his spear, not to march, but just to stand and be a part of this silent, luminous moment. The moon continued its slow, regal arch across the sky, moving past its zenith and beginning the long, imperceptible descent toward the western horizon. On the wall, the world had settled into a profound, crystallized silence. The wind, which had earlier swept the clouds away, had now exhausted itself, dying down to a barely felt breath of air. The stillness was absolute. It was a silence so deep that it felt heavy, pressing gently against Cassius's eardrums. He stood motionless at his post, his elbows resting on the cold stone of the parapet, his chin propped on his gloved hands. He was no longer scanning for threats. He was simply watching the night live its secret life. He looked down into the deep, grassy ditch that ran parallel to the wall, the defensive vallum. In the daylight, it was a scar in the earth, a military obstacle. But under the silver glaze of the moon, it had become a sheltered valley, a highway for the creatures that owned this land long before the legions arrived. He saw a movement. It was fluid and low to the ground. A fox, painted in shades of gray and silver by the moonlight, was trotting along the bottom of the ditch. Its movements were liquid, a silent flow of fur and muscle. Cassius watched it stop. He saw the fox lift its pointed nose to the air, testing the sense of the night. It froze, one paw raised, a statue of alertness. Then, satisfied that the stone giant on the wall posed no danger, it continued its trot, disappearing into the shadows of a hawthorn bush. Cassius smiled inside his helmet. He felt a strange kinship with the animal. They were both solitary wanderers of the dark, both awake while the rest of the world slept. Then a shadow detached itself from the air above him. It was a movement so silent, so sudden, that it felt like a trick of the eye. A barn owl, white as a ghost, glided over the battlements. It passed no more than 3 arm lengths from his face. Cassius held his breath. He saw the incredible, soft span of its wings, feathers specifically shaped by nature to silence the air. There was no whoosh, no flutter, no sound of displacement. It was simply there, and then it was gone. He turned his head slowly to follow its path. The bird banked gracefully, its pale underbelly flashing like a mirror, and landed on a stone merlon 20 paces away. He watched the owl. It sat upright, regal and composed. It swiveled its heart-shaped face, scanning the tall grasses below with eyes designed to pierce the deepest gloom. For a long moment, soldier and bird shared the watch. 2 hunters, 2 sentinels, one of iron and duty, one of feather and instinct. The owl did not seem to care about the empire. It did not care about the border. To the bird, the Great Wall was just a convenient cliff, a perch built of stone for its convenience. This thought humbled Cassius. The grandest works of Rome were, in the end, just part of the landscape for the wild things. The temperature dropped another degree. It was the deepest part of the night now, the wolf hour, the time when the blood moves slowest and the spirit is quietest. Cassius looked down at the stone directly beneath his hands. The moisture from the earlier mist was undergoing a change. The water droplets were no longer liquid. They were beginning to bloom into ice. He watched, fascinated, as tiny, crystalline patterns of frost began to form on the rough granite. They were delicate, fern-like structures, growing slowly, silently, spreading across the rock like a white lace. He saw the frost touching the iron tip of his spear, dulling the shine of the metal with a coat of white powder. He felt the cold stiffening the leather of his tunic, making it rigid. He felt the chill trying to creep into his boots, but he welcomed it. It was a clarifying cold. It kept him awake. It made him feel alive. He breathed out, and his breath was now a thick, solid cloud of white fog that hung in the air for seconds before dispersing. He was a dragon of the north, breathing smoke into the freeze. The silence was broken only by the very distant, rhythmic sound of water, far below. In a stream that fed the lough, water was tumbling over rocks. It was a continuous, murmuring sound, a white noise that smoothed out the edges of his thoughts. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the water wash over him. He imagined the water flowing, clear and cold, over round pebbles, moving endlessly towards the sea. It was a comforting thought. Everything was moving. The moon, the stars, the water, the fox, the owl. Only the wall stood still, and he, for this night, was part of the wall. He opened his eyes again. The owl was gone, vanished as silently as it had arrived. The fox was gone. The frost was growing. He shifted his weight, breaking the thin crust of ice that had formed around his boots, and turned his face towards the east. He did not know when, but soon the world would begin to turn again. For now, he was content to stand in the beautiful, frozen heart of the night. The night did not end with a shout. It ended with a surrender. Cassius, standing still on the eastern-facing battlement, felt the change before he saw it. The air, which had been crisp and thin under the high moon, seemed to settle. The biting wind that had tugged at his cloak for hours finally lay down to rest in the hither, leaving behind a profound, suspended stillness. It was the hush that comes before the world wakes up. He watched the sky. The silver dominion of the moon was fading. The great white orb had sunk lower behind him, losing its brilliant fire, turning pale and translucent like a coin worn smooth by time. In front of him, towards the east, the absolute blackness of the void was undergoing a subtle alchemy. It was a slow dilution. It was as if a single drop of clear water had been added to a jar of dark ink. The deep, impenetrable charcoal of the heavens was softening, shifting imperceptibly into a rich, heavy indigo. He leaned forward, resting his weight on the stone merlon, straining his eyes against the gloom. There, on the very edge of the world, where the dark silhouette of the hills met the sky, he saw it. It was a line, a faint, fragile ribbon of color. It was not yet light. It was merely a suggestion of light. It was a bruise of pale violet, a whisper of slate gray, stretching across the horizon. It was the first breath of the morning. High above this faint line, a single star remained. It was the morning star Venus, the herald of the sun. It burned with a fierce, cold intensity, brighter now that its companions had faded away. It hung there like a lantern suspended in the blue twilight, a solitary witness to the turning of the tide. Cassius fixed his eyes on it. It was a point of focus, a steady anchor as the rest of the sky began to dissolve into lighter shades. With the coming of the gray light, the world began to regain its form. The landscape below the wall, which had been a mystery of shadows all night, started to reveal its true shape. He could see the dark patches of gorse bushes emerging from the gloom. He could see the meandering line of the stream in the valley floor, no longer just a sound, but a visible ribbon of steel, gray water. The colors were muted, washed out, monochromatic, but they were there. The world was reassembling itself. He heard the first sound of the new day. It was not a trumpet or a command. It was a single, hesitant chirp from the long grass in the ditch below. A skylark waking in its ground nest, testing the air. Then silence again. Then, a moment later, another chirp, this time more confident. Then a rustle of wings. The wildlife was stirring. the night shift of the owl, and the fox was over. The day shift was beginning. Cassius felt a shift in his own body. The heaviness of the long, dark hours began to lift. The numbness in his toes and fingers remained, but his mind felt lighter. He shifted his shoulders, rolling them beneath the heavy armor plates, loosening the stiffness. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the cold moisture of the dew that had settled on his beard. He looked at his hand. In the growing twilight, he could see the grain of the leather glove, the stitching on the seams. He did not need the moon anymore. He took a deep breath of the changing air. It smelled different now. The metallic scent of the frost was fading, replaced by the rising scent of the damp earth, a smell of soil and roots preparing to be warmed by the sun. It was the smell of beginning. He stood tall, straightening his back, turning his face fully towards the lightening horizon. He was no longer just guarding the dark. He was waiting to welcome the sun. The long vigil was nearly done. The cycle was complete. The wall had held. The night had passed. And now the light was coming home. The transformation was absolute. The sun, a burning arc of pure gold, pushed itself above the ridge of the eastern hills. In an instant, the monochrome world was painted in color. The gray stone of the wall blushed with warmth, turning a soft, sandy beige. The wet grass in the valley below didn't just shine. It sparkled with a million prismatic diamonds as the light hit the dew. The sky above shed its last layer of indigo and burst into a pale, brilliant blue. The air, though still cold, carried the distinct promise of the day's coming heat. From the distant fort, a sound drifted up to the wall. It was the low, resonant call of the cornu, the military trumpet, signaling the start of the first watch of the day. It was a mournful but welcoming sound, echoing off the stone and rolling down the valley. Cassius let out a long, shuddering sigh, his shoulders finally dropping the tension they had held all night. He heard the rhythmic crunch of footsteps approaching from the west. He did not need to turn to know who it was. It was Valerius, the relief. The footsteps stopped. Cassius turned slowly. Valerius looked fresh, his eyes bright, his armor polished and gleaming in the new sun. They stood facing each other for a moment, the two halves of the cycle meeting, the night guard and the day guard. The night was quiet, Cassius said, his voice raspy from hours of silence. The day looks bright, Valerius replied softly. No other words were needed. Cassius stepped back, relinquishing his post. He handed the solitude of the wall over to his brother in arms. He began the walk back to the Mile Castle stairs. His legs were heavy, a dull ache throbbing in his thighs. But it was a good ache, the ache of work finished. He descended the stone steps, leaving the high winds and the open sky behind. He walked back along the gravel path toward the barracks. The fort was waking up. He smelled wood smoke, stronger now, mixed with the smell of baking grain and porridge. He saw men washing their faces in troughs of cold water, their breath steaming in the morning air. They nodded to him as he passed, a silent respect for the watcher returning from the dark. He reached the heavy oak door of his barrack block. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick, warm, and dim. The fire had been stoked. He walked to his bunk and sat down heavily on the wooden edge. Slowly, methodically, he began to undo the work of the previous evening. He unbuckled the belt, the bronze studs jingling softly as he laid it aside. He undid the leather straps of the lorica segmentata, lifting the heavy iron plates from his shoulders. As the weight left him, he felt he might float away. He placed the armor on its stand, a silent shell waiting for the next night. He unlaced his boots, peeling the damp leather from his tired feet. Finally, he lay back. The wool blanket was scratchy but warm. The straw mattress rustled beneath him, shaping itself to his body. He closed his eyes. The images of the night played behind his eyelids. The swirling mist, the silver moon, the silent owl, the frost on the stone. They were drifting away now, receding into the distance. The sounds of the waking fort outside, the blacksmith's hammer, the horses, the voices, blended into a gentle, rhythmic hum. He took one deep breath, smelling the lavender and the smoke. His duty was done. The wall was safe. The sun was up. And now, at last, there was only the drift into the deep, harborless ocean of sleep. And so, Cassius has found his rest, and our journey to the ancient, northern edge of the world comes to a quiet close. Thank you for walking these stone paths with us tonight. Thank you for braving the mist, watching the moon, and waiting for the sun. I hope the slow rhythm of the wall has settled into your own breathing. I hope the silence of the hills has found a place in your mind. You have done enough for today, just like our wary sentinel. There are no more watches you need to keep. There are no more distances you need to walk. You are safe, you are warm, and you are exactly where you need to be. Let the images of the silver night fade gently. Let the weight of your own day be lifted from your shoulders. Piece by piece, just as the armor was set aside. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let the darkness be a comfort, a soft blanket wrapping around you. Drift away now into your own peaceful, dreamless night. Sleep well. Good night.